And I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Sri Lanka.
Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished representatives, examining the use of veto power is not an easy undertaking. First of all, objective analysis is hampered, I say, by the fact that states often fail to provide clarification of their exact motives for casting a vote. Even when states do give a public explanation, this will not necessarily correspond to the real reason. There is also the problem of the use of the so-called hidden veto, whereby a permanent member is threatened to use its veto if a certain measure or statement is put to vote. Now, this mechanism used mainly in closed-door informal consultations rather than in open meetings, which makes it extremely difficult to gain information on its use and assess its effects on the work of the Security Council. Mr. President, however, our task today is to shed some views regarding the exercise of the veto power in the context of the wording and, more importantly, the spirit of Article 27 of the United Nations Charter. Mr. President, looking beyond permanency itself, the veto power is probably the UN Charter's more significant distinction between permanent and non-permanent members. Article 27.3 of the Charter establishes that all substantive decisions of the Council must be made with, quote, the concurring votes of the permanent members, close quotes. The veto has been therefore discussed many times and regularly during the annual working methods debates and is among the topics more frequently raised, I say, in the context of almost all discussions of the Council's working methods. Distinguished representatives and excellencies, we know that permanent members use the veto to defend their national interest, to uphold a tenet of their foreign policy, or sometimes to promote a single issue of significant importance to member states. It might be interesting to note since the cast of the first veto on a draft resolution regarding the withdrawal of foreign troops, the veto has been recorded 293 times. Mr. President, it is observed that since the end of the Cold War in 1991, new practices have been introduced in the usage in the veto by the different permanent members. I must, however, mention that these methods of usage have not been altogether beneficial to the member states and international community at large. You will appreciate that the veto affects the work of the Council in numerous ways, that it goes beyond the actual use of the veto in the course of the voting. We have seen the practice for a draft resolution not to be formally tabled because of the threat of the veto by one or more permanent members. You will appreciate that it is not easy to document if a paper trail can be followed only and only if a draft is circulated as a Council document, which in the ordinary course happens when there is a strong expectation of the resolution being adopted. We have also seen that in some occasions, the sponsoring member states of a draft resolution may put it to a vote knowing full well that it will be vetoed simply with the intention to record symbolic support in respect of a particular issue within the Council. Excellencies, it is an interesting matter of record that following the 2000 Millennium Summit, which led to the 2005 World Summit, the high-level panel on threats, challenges, and changes made a strong call on the permanent members in their personal capacities to give serious thought and commit themselves to refrain from the use of veto in cases of genocide and serious violations of human rights or mass-scale human rights abuses. Several governments following this summit moved to permanent members to refrain from using a veto, to block Council action that would prevent genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. This was followed in 2013 by a group of members that formed an informal caucus to promote for improved Security Council working methods. The mechanism was put in place on the 2nd of May that year and was described as an accountability, coherence, and transparency bearing a cross-regional group of 27 states with a view to increasing the effectiveness of the Council by improving its methods, inclusive of introducing checks and balances on the use of the veto. Excellencies, this mechanism, described in short as the acronym of ACT, ACT, worked on a code of conduct for member states in the Security Council when they examined matters of genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes, and endeavored to persuade to refrain from using their veto in situations involving mass atrocity crimes, and invited the members of the Council to accede to the code, as in the case of other states that at some future point in time would aspire to be members of the Council. Mr. President, the response unfortunately was rather, fortunately was rather encouraging, with 120 member states supporting the Code of Conduct, including 2 members of the Council and 8 elected members who are serving in the year 2020. It is of interest, therefore, to note that from the 2000s, certain members have advocated a voluntary restraint by the permanent members on the exercise of the veto. There was even a ministerial event on this issue in September of 2014 on the side of the 69th session of this Assembly, and we recall the then Commissioner for Human Rights having made a statement in support of that initiative, which called on the P5 voluntarily and collectively not to use the veto in cases of genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes, or on a large scale. Regrettably, only 1 member state of the permanent members supported this initiative. Mr. President, we heard this morning the opening statement of the PGA, followed by the statement by His Excellency the Ambassador for Liechtenstein, calling for a strengthening of the accountability of the Council by the General Assembly procedure to discuss the use of the veto. There was a salutary reminder that the veto is no longer the end of the conversation, that we have to safeguard the credibility of the General Assembly and use the collective use of the political will of the General Assembly to address this serious issue. Mr. President, how then should one evaluate the exercise of the veto and the numerous proposals for reform? As one academic puts it, for the most member states, Article 27, he describes it as a codification of the stark reality that some states are more equal than others, while this principle, of course, does not reflect the ethos in Article 1, Sub-Article 2 of the UN Charter, which aims at developing friendly relations between nations structured on respect for the hallowed principle of equal rights of people, and the provisions of Article 2.1, which in unequivocal terms establishes the principle of sovereign equality of one of the basic pillars of the present-day United Nations. Mr. President, let us, however, not forget the fact that the motivation that prompted the former sponsoring states in 1945 is structured on the requirement of a guarantee to maintain peaceful relations between the principal powers of the world and to assure their support in the maintenance of world peace, and that could be achieved only by the adoption of a mechanism that will assure the important national interests of the principle of the UN member states, while recognizing the fact that it would be the responsibility of these important member states to maintain international peace and security throughout the United Nations. It is a matter of historical fact that the reasons that underpin the insertion of Article 27 were well-founded in the context of the demise of the League of Nations. It would appear, therefore, Mr. President, that over the last 75 years, the P5 has ostensibly bonded together with greater accommodation on several issues of global interest. It has, however, been observed that notwithstanding the fact that the logic behind the veto is not wholly unfounded, does not prevent its actions from being problematic. May I conclude by reminding ourselves of the need to prevent the most worrisome type of veto exercise which impedes the Security Council from international crimes, where large-scale killings of civilians are taking place for the reason that these actions are not reconcilable with the objectives of the UN Charter, with the importance of basic having no regard for human rights, having regard to the present states of international relations. Permit me to conclude by making the observation that these veto debates, though emotionally charged, with both parties, the P5 and the member states, pursuing their views and paying little attention to the rationale of the arguments of one or the other, it is Sri Lanka's view that any charter reform must visit the issue of the exercise of the veto, and that it is time that all member states, inclusive of the P5, engage in an open and frank discussion having regard to the happenings of recent times that compel us to take serious note of the requirement of the maintenance of international peace and of security. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Sri Lanka.